In the summer of 1943, near Kursk, there was not a single one of those things that usually decide the outcome of great battles. There was no surprise. There was no mystery. There was no cunning plan that the enemy would learn of too late. By July, on this sector of the front, both armies knew almost everything about each other. The Germans knew that the Russians were expecting an attack and were digging into the ground. The Russians knew that the Germans were preparing an offensive, amassing tanks and pulling up reserves. The soldiers in the trenches under the scorching sun felt that a huge mass of metal had already been gathered somewhere nearby, beyond the horizon, and that one morning it would simply move towards them. And yet, knowing this, both sides moved to meet each other. This is precisely the main strangeness of Kursk. It was a battle without mystery, prepared for over months, which nonetheless turned into one of the most costly operations in terms of human lives of the entire war. The main question around which this entire story should be built is this. If both sides knew in advance where the blow would fall, roughly when it would begin and with what forces, why did neither side manage to win the battle quickly and cheaply? Why did predictability, which on paper should have given the defenders a huge advantage and the attackers a reason to abandon the venture altogether, in reality turn the Kursk salient into a giant machine of mutual exhaustion? And why did the most famous episode of this battle, the tank field near Prokhorovka, over time become overgrown with a legend that turned out to be much larger and smoother than what actually happened there? To understand how this became possible, one must go back a little, to the winter and spring of '43. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad, where a surrounded German army capitulated in the winter, the front swung westward. The Red Army advanced, liberated cities, drove the enemy back, but by spring, it had run out of steam. Stretched supply lines, tired divisions, broken roads, the offensive stopped itself. And then the Germans launched a counterblow near Kharkov, retook the city, and stabilized the front line. As a result of these opposing movements, a huge salient formed in the front line in the Kursk region. It jutted into the German disposition like a blunt wedge and was visible on any staff map in an instant. From the north, one German wing loomed over it. From the south, another. The geometry itself seemed to suggest a solution. The idea born in German headquarters was simple to the point of primitiveness, and it was this simplicity that made it predictable. To cut off the salient with two converging blows at its base, one blow from the north, another from the south. If both wedges broke through the defense and met east of Kursk, several Soviet armies would be caught in a giant cauldron. This would have returned the initiative to the Wehrmacht, destroyed large forces of the Red Army, and at least for a time postponed what after Stalingrad already felt like inevitability. The operation was named in such a way that the name itself promised an impregnable fortress and a crushing blow. But the problem was that not only a German general could draw two arrows converging near Kursk on a map. The enemy saw the same thing. The Soviet command deciphered the plan early and without much difficulty. The contours of the salient, the disposition of German groupings, the concentration of tank divisions, intelligence data, including from agent sources and allies, everything pointed to one spot. The debate within the Soviet leadership was not about whether there would be a blow, but about what to do. There was a temptation to strike first, to preempt, but a different logic prevailed, and it is worth naming it. To consciously cede the initiative, to assume a stubborn defense, to wear down the German tank divisions on pre-prepared lines, and only then, when the attacker was exhausted, to launch one's own offensive. This was a difficult decision. To voluntarily give the first move to an army that for 4 years had been considered a master of the first move required confidence. And this confidence was built on the ground, or rather, in the ground. What the Soviet troops did with the Kursk salient during the spring and early summer does not fit well into the usual word defense. It was not a line of trenches, but a system dozens of kilometers deep, one line after another, and behind them more and more. By various estimates, many thousands of kilometers of trenches and communication trenches were dug. If laid in a single line, they would cover distances comparable to the length of entire countries. Hundreds of thousands of mines, anti-tank and anti-personnel, were laid in the ground in whole fields, counting on the tanks coming precisely here. The main nodes of this defense became anti-tank strongpoints, small, carefully concealed groups of guns, positioned to fire at the flanks of breakthrough vehicles, support each other with fire, and deny tanks a clear corridor. To this were added dug-in tanks, artillery ambushes, and engineering obstacles. The local population, women and teenagers, dug alongside the soldiers. The earth of the Kursk salient was turned into a trap in advance, methodically, with a cool head. And here arises the first of those knots without which the entire battle cannot be understood. The German offensive was postponed several times. Initially, the blow could have occurred in the spring, when the Soviet defense was not so deep and reserves were not pulled up. But the commander, who placed his main bet on new technology, insisted on a delay. He wanted to wait until new heavy and medium tanks, new heavy assault guns, arrived at the front to strike for sure. The logic was clear, to throw into battle not just many machines, but machines that qualitatively surpassed everything the enemy had. But time had a reverse side. Every week of delay, granted by the German side to accumulate equipment, turned for the Soviet side into new kilometers of trenches, new minefields, new guns in strongpoints. The delay, intended to strengthen the blow, simultaneously strengthened the one against whom this blow was being prepared. The longer the Germans waited for the perfect moment, the less perfect it became. This is the first cause and effect chain of the entire operation. The bet on wonder weapons required time. Time gave the enemy the opportunity to deepen the defense. The deepened defense deprived the offensive of a chance for a quick breakthrough, and the absence of a quick breakthrough turned the whole venture into something the German army could no longer afford by 43. A protracted battle of attrition, where victory is determined not by skill in maneuver, but by the ability to replenish losses. In a war of attrition, Germany no longer held good cards after Stalingrad. It is worth honestly speaking about the forces of the sides, but without turning it into a dry list. On the German side, selected tank and motorized formations were committed, including the SS Tank Corps on the southern face, Army Tank Corps on the north. New heavy tanks with long guns and thick frontal armor were gathered here, new medium tanks that would later become some of the most famous machines of the war, heavy assault guns with anti-shell protection that seemed almost invulnerable from the front on the battlefield. On paper, this was a terrifying concentration of quality. Each such machine in a one-on-one duel at range held an advantage over the main Soviet tank. The German side was counting precisely on this qualitative superiority in equipment and on the training of their crews. The Red Army responded differently. It responded with depth, numbers, artillery, and a pre-prepared battlefield. The backbone of the tank forces was the medium T-34 tank with a 76mm gun, a reliable, mobile, simple-to-produce machine, but its gun could no longer penetrate the front armor of the new German heavy tanks at long ranges. There were light tanks which could do almost nothing against the new German armor. There were powerful anti-tank guns, howitzers, rocket launchers, masses of rifle divisions, and engineering units. And there was depth in the deployment. Behind the fronts holding the defense in the north and south of the salient stood yet another front, an entire strategic reserve ready to be committed. The Germans formed a fist. The Soviet side built a labyrinth and kept a spare army behind its back. On paper, in headquarters offices, the German plan looked logical. Concentrate the maximum number of tanks and heavy equipment on narrow sectors, breach the defense with a concentrated blow, introduce mobile formations into the breach, and close the ring. This had worked more than once in previous years. Staff maps showed arrows, and the arrows converged confidently east of Kursk. But a staff map can show movement and cannot show the resistance of every meter. It does not show that beneath the thin blue line of defense lies not one, but 7 or 8 successive lines. It does not show minefields, across which a tank crawls, not races. It does not show anti-tank guns firing into the flank from concealed positions impossible to spot in advance. The plan was based on a pace that the land of the Kursk salient was not going to allow. On the 5th of July, 1943, the offensive began, and it became clear almost immediately that predictability worked against the attacker. The Soviet side knew about the preparations so well that shortly before the German blow, they conducted a powerful artillery counter-preparation, unleashing fire on the areas where German units were presumed to be assembled for the attack. Historians still assess the effect of this preemptive strike differently, and caution is needed here. Some believe it seriously disrupted the German formations, others that the damage was less than expected because some of the fire fell on empty positions. But the very fact speaks volumes. The attacker lost even the small element of surprise he still had regarding the exact hour. He was advancing across a field that the enemy had already zeroed in. On the northern face of the salient, the German offensive bogged down almost immediately. Here, the defense was held by a front commanded by a general who bet on the density of the anti-tank defense and on correctly guessing the direction of the main blow. He guessed precisely. The German divisions gnawed into the defense, took one position after another, but paid a disproportionately high price for every kilometer, lost tanks to mines and artillery fire, and, most importantly, could not gain momentum. After several days of the heaviest fighting, the northern grouping advanced only to a shallow depth and was essentially exhausted, never breaking through the defense into operational space. The northern wedge broke against the ground before it could become a threat. On the southern face, everything went differently and more dangerously. Here, the German tank formations, including the SS Corps, advanced more successfully, pressing through one line after another, biting dozens of kilometers into the Soviet defense. It was in the south that a situation developed where a breakthrough seemed imminent. But even here, with relative success, the offensive did not proceed as the arrows had drawn it. It went slowly, with heavy losses, constantly lagging behind schedule. Each new line had to be cracked anew, infantry had to be brought up, and they had to wait for engineers to clear passages through minefields, for fuel to arrive, for damaged vehicles to be evacuated and repaired. And the deeper the German tanks pressed into the defense, the narrower the corridor became, the more open flanks the attackers exposed, the denser the fire from the sides became. Here it is worth stopping on the ground in the literal sense, on the terrain, because near Kursk it was not a backdrop but a participant in the battle. It is steppe and forest steppe, open fields, groves, ravines, gullies, small rivers with marshy floodplains, scattered villages. In summer, its own peculiarities were added. Roads used by heavy equipment raised clouds of dust, visible from afar and betraying the movement of columns. Sudden summer downpours turned dirt roads and river floodplains into a viscous mire where even powerful machines got stuck. Ravines and gullies, invisible on the map, became natural anti-tank ditches, traps, and bottlenecks, where an attacking column would stretch out and expose itself to flanking fire. An open field across which a tank advanced towards Soviet positions was swept by fire from end to end. The terrain was not neutral. It was part of the same trap as the minefields and strongpoints. Separately, one must speak of the new German equipment, on which so many hopes were pinned, because it was here that the gap between expectation and reality was particularly harsh. The new medium tank with the long gun, which was supposed to be the striking fist of the offensive, arrived at the front raw, unfinished. Machines broke down on the march, engines caught fire, the running gear failed, and a significant portion of them were knocked out not by enemy fire, but by their own technical malfunctions in the very first days. The heavy assault guns, nearly invulnerable from the front, turned out to be poorly suited for close combat in the depth of the defense, among infantry and anti-tank guns, and suffered losses where their strength did not work. The heavy tanks with thick armor were indeed tough nuts to crack, but there were few of them, and they could not be everywhere. The wonder weapon, for the sake of which the offensive had been delayed, on the ground turned out to be not so much a wonder as a fragile and finicky tool that required repairs, spare parts, and time. That is, exactly what is always lacking in an offensive of attrition. And this is the second major point that is important to state honestly. On paper, the new heavy tank looked like a guarantee of a breakthrough. Thick armor, a powerful gun, a range exceeding anything the enemy had. On the ground, however, it became clear that a tank impossible to penetrate from the front could still be stopped. It could be blown up by a mine. It could be set ablaze by a shot to the flank from a concealed position. It could be immobilized by breaking its track. It could simply be left without fuel and shells by cutting off its supply. The thickest armor does not save from an empty fuel tank or from a gun that fires not at the front, but from the side, point blank, from a place where it was not expected. Superiority in a one-on-one duel at open range meant almost nothing in the labyrinth of defense, where German machines rarely got that very open range. Behind all these schemes, lines, and tank models stands what is easily lost in tales of great battles: the people on the ground. For a Soviet artilleryman in an anti-tank strongpoint, the battle was not an arrow on a map, but a few terrifying minutes when a heavy machine would crawl out of the dust and smoke toward his gun, and he had to let it come closer to be sure of piercing its side, knowing that if he missed with the first shot, there might not be a second. For the driver mechanic of a T-34, it was the cramped space of a scorching hull, the roar of the engine, poor visibility through the slits, and the understanding that his gun would not penetrate a German heavy tank head-on, so he had to get close, to the side, under fire. For a German tanker in a new machine, it was constant anxiety over a temperamental engine, stuffiness, limited visibility, fields seeded with mines, and flanks from which a strike could come at any moment. For infantrymen on both sides, it was heat, dust, thirst, the deafening roar of artillery, and hours-long waiting under fire. These people did not see the big picture. They saw a meter of field in front of them and paid for every meter with their lives. Logistics, rarely told beautifully, decided no less than armor at Kursk. A tank offensive needed rivers of fuel, mountains of shells, an endless stream of spare parts, repair services, and recovery tractors to pull damaged machines from the field and return them to service. On the southern face, as the German wedges deepened into the defense, all of this stretched thin, lagged behind, failed to keep up. A damaged but repairable tank on the battlefield is not an irrevocable loss if the field remains yours, and the machine can be evacuated and repaired. But if the battlefield remains with the enemy, that same tank is lost forever. And in this lay the quiet, unnoticed drama of the battle. The side that held the field at the end of the day not only preserved its positions, it preserved its equipment, because it could collect and repair the damaged. The side that retreated lost even what could formerly have been saved. Supply and evacuation decided the fate of hundreds of machines as surely as the guns did. Command decisions in this battle should be analyzed without gloating, but honestly. The German decision to launch the operation in the summer of '43 was, in essence, a bet against their own understanding of the situation. Within the German leadership, there were people who doubted, who saw how fortified the salient was, and who suggested abandoning the venture, or at least not tying themselves to a frontal assault on the most obvious spot. The logic that prevailed was that the initiative had to be regained at any cost, to strike at that very salient which suggested itself. The decision to attack where you are clearly expected, in a maximally fortified area, against an opponent who dreams of nothing more than you getting bogged down in his defense, this is a decision in which the desire to appear strong outweighed a sober assessment that the offensive had lost its two main trump cards, surprise and tempo. And without them, a shock operation turns into exactly what the defending side was aiming for. And so we come to the most famous episode of the entire battle, the field near Prokhorovka, to the 12th of July, 1943. It was here, as the German southern wedge continued to press, that the Soviet command committed a major tank reserve, the Guards Tank Army, to stop the breakthrough with a frontal counterattack. Soviet tank brigades moved to meet the German SS Tank Corps. What happened next entered history as the largest tank battle, as a head-on clash of armor, as a field littered with burned-out machines. And it is around this day that a legend grew, which over time became larger than the battle itself. The classic version paints an almost epic picture, as if huge masses of tanks, something like 1,200 machines from both sides, clashed head-on a narrow field, and in a giant melee, the Germans lost several hundred tanks, while the Soviet counterattack utterly crushed an elite corps and broke the back of the entire German offensive. This picture migrated for decades from book to book, from film to film. It is beautiful, it is dramatic, it is convenient, and it is here, if one looks closely at the documents, that the legend begins to crack. Later research based on German and Soviet archival documents provided a much more complex and far less triumphant picture. The actual number of tanks that clashed directly near Prokhorovka that day was smaller than the legendary figure. The main point concerns losses. According to data favored by a significant portion of modern historians, the irrevocable losses of the German tank corps that day were surprisingly small. We are talking about single units or a few tens of completely lost machines, because the field largely remained with the Germans and they were able to evacuate and repair many damaged tanks. The Soviet tank army, however, which launched a frontal attack across open terrain against prepared anti-tank defenses, lost many times more, hundreds of machines in a single day, with many of them falling to the attackers precisely because the attack was frontal and went straight into German guns and dug-in tanks. Here we must pause and honestly define the boundaries of our knowledge, because at this point, it is easy to fall from one legend into the opposite. Exact loss figures for Prokhorovka remain a subject of debate to this day. Documents from different headquarters contradict each other. Combat reports, as always happens in war, are guilty of both exaggerating successes and understating one's own losses. Post-war memoirs often painted a more heroic and more straightforward picture than what was on the ground, especially if the author needed to explain the heavy losses of his own troops. Therefore, when it comes to exact numbers of burned-out tanks, caution is mandatory. Different figures appear in the documents, and any single figure stated with too much confidence should be viewed with suspicion. But the general direction in which understanding has shifted raises almost no doubt. Prokhorovka was not a pure, brilliant victory of Soviet armor over German in a fair duel. It was a heavy, bloody, and in many ways unsuccessful in its immediate result frontal counterattack, paid for with enormous losses in equipment. And yet, and here is another important twist, while destroying the beautiful legend, one must not fall into the opposite extreme and declare Prokhorovka a Soviet defeat and the entire battle a German success. Because a battle has two different dimensions, tactical and strategic. Tactically, that day at Prokhorovka cost the Soviet side dearly. Strategically, however, the counterattack achieved the main thing. It stopped. He deprived the German southern wedge of its last chance to break out into operational space, forced the German command to feel that Soviet reserves were not running out, that behind every breached line stood a new one, that behind every shattered tank formation, a fresh one appeared. The price was terrible, but the exhaustion, for which the entire Soviet defense had been built, had occurred. The advancing force had hit a wall, behind which another wall was discovered. By that moment, several factors had converged over the German offensive at once, and they form another chain of cause and effect. The Allies had landed on an island in the Mediterranean, opening a new threat in the south of Europe, and the German leadership urgently needed forces that could only be taken from the Eastern Front. Simultaneously, the Soviet side, as planned from the very beginning, transitioned from defense to its own offensive operations north and south of the salient, striking the flanks of the already exhausted German groupings. The German offensive, having not yet achieved a breakthrough, found itself under threat. And then the operation was halted. Not because it was almost won, but because it could no longer be won, and to continue holding it meant exhausting the last mobile reserves for a goal that had become unattainable. The consequences of this battle extended far beyond the fields of Kursk. The Wehrmacht conducted its last major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front at Kursk. After that summer, the initiative passed definitively and irrevocably to the Red Army. Ahead lay a long, hard, bloody path westward, with heavy battles and great losses, but it would now be a movement in one direction. The German army after Kursk transitioned to defense and retreat, to attempts to plug holes, to a strategy in which there was no longer room for major offensive designs on this front. The tank formations, so carefully preserved and accumulated for the summer, were ground down in the battles, and Germany could no longer replenish these losses with the same quality. The exhaustion, on which the defending side had bet, worked at all levels simultaneously, both on the tactical field and in the strategic disposition of the entire war. The memory of this battle has a separate fate. Kursk, and especially Prokhorovka, became a symbol, and this symbol over time began to live its own life, drifting further and further away from the documents. It is understandable why it turned out this way. After the terrible price, a story of victory was needed, simple and majestic, in which Soviet armor in open battle crushed the best German tank units. Such a story consoles and explains the sacrifices, but the real picture was more complex and terrible. The victory was achieved not by the brilliance of a single tank ram, but by months of hard labor in the earth, precise calculation of defense, the willingness to pay an enormous price, and the ability to replenish losses which the enemy no longer possessed. Later memory simplified this story, rounded the numbers, turned the heavy and ambiguous counterblow into an impeccable triumph. And in this simplification, those who burned in their tanks on the open field of July 12th, going into a frontal attack that cost far more than was later customary to recall, dissolved unnoticed. If one tries to reduce everything to a single thought, then Kursk is a story about how predictability does not make war cheap. One can know everything about an impending strike, the place, time, forces, direction. One can prepare as thoroughly as the earth and time allow. And still the price will be terrible, because when the element of surprise disappears, so does the possibility of a quick, low-cost victory. What remains is a frontal collision of attrition, where the winner is not the one who is more cunning, but the one who can endure longer and replenish what is lost faster. Both sides at Kursk awaited this battle for months. Both came to it armed with full knowledge, and that is precisely why neither of them could win it cheaply. And perhaps the main thing worth taking from this field lies not in the numbers of losses nor in the models of tanks, but in that gap between the map and the ground, which is the true price of war. In headquarters, they moved arrows, accumulated divisions, calculated the pace of breakthrough and the timing of closing the ring. And on the ground, all this turned into empty fuel tanks, broken tracks, a shot into the side from cover, hours-long waiting under shelling, and that last meter of open field which for thousands of people became the last in their lives. The legend will later smooth over this gap, make the story more beautiful and smoother than it was. But if Kursk is to be remembered honestly, it is precisely about this distance between the confident line on the map and the person who pays for it with himself.